At 8:15 in the morning on August 6, 1945, the sky over Hiroshima tore open with a light brighter than 1,000 suns. The atomic bomb Little Boy detonated at 600 meters altitude, releasing the equivalent of 15,000 tons of TNT and instantly vaporizing everything within a radius of 1,600 meters. Concrete buildings melted like wax. Human bodies became burned shadows on the asphalt. More than 80,000 people died in the first seconds. But just 8 blocks from the epicenter of the explosion, at 1,200 meters from ground zero, something impossible happened that science still cannot fully explain. 8 Jesuit priests were living in a small rectory next to Our Lady of the Assumption Church when the atomic fire consumed Hiroshima. Father Hubert Schiffer, Father Wilhelm Kleinsorger, Father Superior Hugo LaSalle and 5 other members of the Society of Jesus should have been vaporized, burned, or at minimum fatally irradiated like the 140,000 people who would eventually die from the attack. The blast wave that pulverized concrete buildings and tossed trains like toys should have crushed them. The radiation that would cause cancers and deaths for decades should have destroyed their cells. The firestorm that reached temperatures of 4,000 degrees Celsius should have reduced them to ash. Yet when the mushroom cloud rose over the ruins of the city, these 8 men walked out of the wreckage without a single burn, without radiation sickness, without even a scratch that required medical attention. This is not a legend whispered in the corridors of faith. This is documented history. These priests were examined repeatedly by medical teams, scientists, and researchers over the following decades. More than 200 physicians studied them at various points in their lives. Every test came back the same. No radiation effects, no cataracts, no cancers, no leukemia, no cellular damage whatsoever. They lived long lives while thousands around them who were farther from the blast died slow, agonizing deaths from radiation poisoning. Father Schiffer himself would live until 1994, dying at age 90 from causes completely unrelated to Hiroshima. He was interviewed more than 1,000 times about that morning, and his answer never changed. Hiroshima, in August of 1945, was a city holding its breath. The war had turned against Japan and everyone knew it. American B-29 bombers had already reduced 67 Japanese cities to ash with conventional firebombs. But Hiroshima had been mysteriously spared. While Tokyo burned and Osaka smoldered, Hiroshima remained untouched, its 300,000 residents living in an eerie limbo, waiting for the fire they knew was coming. The city was home to the Second Army headquarters, making it a legitimate military target in American eyes. But it was also packed with civilians, families, children, and among them, this small community of German Jesuit missionaries who had chosen to stay despite the war, despite the danger, despite every rational reason to flee. These were not naive men. Father Kleinsorger had seen the firebombing campaigns. Father LaSalle understood the strategic situation. They knew Hiroshima's turn was coming. Yet they remained at their posts, continuing their daily routines, celebrating Mass, serving their parishioners, and according to their own accounts, praying the Rosary together every single day. It was a practice they had maintained without fail since arriving in Japan, a simple devotion that took 15 minutes each evening. On the night of August 5th, they prayed as usual, unaware that in less than 12 hours they would become witnesses to the most powerful weapon ever used in warfare and the most puzzling survival story in modern history. The question that would haunt investigators, scientists, and believers for the next 8 decades was brutally simple. How did 8 men survive at ground zero when everyone else died? The priests themselves offered an answer that science rejected but could never disprove. An answer that turned this bombing into something far more mysterious than just another tragedy of war. An answer that begins with a simple string of beads and a prayer repeated in the ruins of a church that should not have been standing. To understand what happened in Hiroshima, you need to understand who these men were before the bomb fell. The Jesuit mission in Japan was not some last-minute wartime posting. These priests had been in the country for years, some for over a decade, building relationships, learning the language, and integrating themselves into a society that historically viewed outsiders with suspicion. Father Hubert Schiffer had arrived in Japan in 1935 at the age of 30, a German intellectual who threw himself into mastering Japanese language and culture. Father Wilhelm Kleinsorge came in 1936, a quiet, methodical man who would become known for his tireless work with the sick and dying. They were not tourists playing at missionary work. They were committed, embedded, and by 1945 they considered Japan their home, even as their homeland Germany was allied with Japan against the country that would soon drop the bomb. The rectory where they lived was a modest wooden structure typical of Japanese architecture, located in the Nobori-cho district, just 1,200 meters from what would become Ground Zero. It sat adjacent to Our Lady of the Assumption Church, which served a small but devoted Catholic community in a predominantly Buddhist and Shinto city. The building had paper screens, wooden beams, and none of the structural reinforcement that might explain survival. It was, by every measure, as vulnerable as every other structure in Hiroshima. The priests lived simply, following the Jesuit tradition of poverty and service. Their daily routine included morning mass, pastoral work in the community, study, and their evening rosary, a practice they had committed to as a community spiritual discipline. According to later testimonies, they had made a specific promise to pray the rosary together every single day in reparation and for protection, though the exact nature of this promise would become a subject of intense debate. By the summer of 1945, life in Hiroshima had become a strange mixture of routine and dread. Food was scarce, the military presence was heavy, air raid sirens wailed regularly, though no bombs had yet fallen on the city. Residents went to work, children attended school, and people tried to maintain normalcy, while knowing that devastation could arrive at any moment. The Jesuits continued their ministry, but they were also realists. They had discussed evacuation. They had considered leaving for the countryside where other missionaries had fled. But they made a conscious decision to stay with their parishioners, believing that abandoning the community in its hour of need would betray everything they claimed to believe. It was a decision rooted in faith, duty, and perhaps a touch of fatalism that religious men sometimes embrace when confronted with forces beyond their control. The morning of August 6th began like any other. Father Kleinsorge woke early, as was his habit, and prepared for morning mass. Father Schiffer was reading in his room. The other priests were scattered through the rectory, beginning their daily routines. The summer heat was already building, promising another sweltering day. There were no air raid warnings, no sirens, no indication that this morning would be different from any other morning in the grinding final months of the war. At 8:14 and 30 seconds, the Enola Gay, a B-29 Superfortress bomber flying at 31,000 feet, released its payload over the center of Hiroshima. The bomb fell for 43 seconds before detonation. At 8:15 exactly, the world changed. The flash came first, a light so intense it burned shadows onto walls and sidewalks. Then the heat wave, a wall of thermal radiation traveling at the speed of light, setting fires and melting flesh. Finally, the blast wave, traveling at the speed of sound, arriving seconds later with the force to flatten everything in its path. In the rectory, the priests experienced all three in rapid succession, and then in the chaos and fire and screaming silence that followed, they realized something impossible. They were still alive. The sensation Father Schiffer described in later interviews was not like anything he had experienced before. He was sitting at a table near a window when the flash came, a blinding white light that seemed to penetrate through his closed eyelids. He instinctively threw himself to the floor, and in that exact moment the blast wave hit. The windows exploded inward, sending glass shards flying through the room like thousands of tiny daggers. The wooden walls buckled and groaned. The ceiling beams cracked with sounds like gunshots. Everything that could move was thrown violently through the air. And yet, when Father Schiffer picked himself up from the floor seconds later, he had not a single cut from the glass that had shredded everything around him. His clothes were intact. His skin was unburned, despite the thermal flash that had carbonized human beings 800 meters away. He was conscious, mobile, and completely unharmed in a building that should have been his coffin. Father Kleinsorge experienced the same impossible survival. He had been standing in a different room when the explosion occurred, and the blast threw him across the space, slamming him into a wall with enough force that he should have suffered broken bones at minimum. Instead, he stood up, shook his head to clear the ringing in his ears, and began searching for the other priests. Throughout the rectory, the same scene repeated. Father Lassalle emerged from his room unscathed. The other priests called out to each other in the darkness created by the dust cloud that had enveloped the city. One by one, they confirmed the impossible reality. All 8 were alive, all 8 were conscious, and all 8 were essentially uninjured. The building around them was damaged, but still standing, a wooden structure that had somehow withstood a blast wave that had obliterated concrete buildings twice as far from ground zero. What they saw when they stepped outside defied comprehension. Hiroshima had ceased to exist. The city that had been there moments before had been replaced by a hellscape of fire and rubble stretching to the horizon. Buildings were flattened in every direction. Fires burned everywhere, merging into a single massive firestorm that created its own wind system, pulling debris and people into the flames. The priests could see bodies, or what remained of bodies, scattered through the ruins. Some victims were still moving, crawling through the wreckage with skin hanging from their arms in sheets. Their clothes burned away, their eyes melted shut. The screaming was constant, a chorus of agony rising from thousands of throats. The heat was intense even at street level, and the air was thick with smoke and the sickening smell of burning flesh. This was what the end of the world looked like, and the priests were standing in the middle of it without a scratch. Their training as Jesuits and their experience as pastoral workers immediately took over. Whatever had just happened, whatever impossible thing had spared them, was not as important as the people dying around them. Father Kleinsorger began organizing rescue efforts, directing the other priests to search for survivors in the immediate area. They pulled people from collapsed buildings, carried the wounded away from fires, and offered what comfort they could to the dying. The rectory itself, though damaged, became an impromptu aid station. The priests brought in dozens of victims, laying them on whatever surfaces remained, providing water and in many cases simply staying with people as they died. Through it all, none of the 8 priests showed any signs of radiation exposure. No nausea, no hair loss, no burns, no bleeding from the gums or under the skin that characterized acute radiation syndrome. They worked for hours in the radioactive ruins without protection, direct contact with victims whose bodies were saturated with fallout, and suffered no consequences. By nightfall, the full scale of the catastrophe was becoming clear. Though no one yet understood what weapon had caused it, the priests knew only that an entire city had been destroyed in a single instant by something beyond their comprehension. They had no explanation for their survival. They had no framework to understand what had happened. All they knew was that they were alive when everyone around them was dead or dying, and that simple fact would haunt them, puzzle scientists, and inspire believers for the rest of their lives. The real mystery, however, was only beginning to reveal itself. In the days following the bombing, as the true nature of the weapon became known and the death toll continued to climb, medical teams began arriving in Hiroshima to treat survivors and document the effects of atomic radiation. What they found was a clear pattern. Distance from the hypocenter determined survival. People within 1 kilometer of ground zero were almost universally killed instantly or died within hours. Those between 1 and 2 kilometers away suffered severe radiation burns, acute radiation syndrome, and high mortality rates. Beyond 2 kilometers, survival rates improved, but radiation sickness still claimed thousands of lives in the weeks and months that followed. The medical data was consistent, predictable, and scientifically sound, except for 8 men who simply did not fit the pattern at all. The first medical examinations of the Jesuit priests happened within weeks of the bombing. American military doctors, Japanese physicians, and international medical teams all wanted to understand the effects of this new weapon, and the priests were examined along with thousands of other survivors. The initial reports noted their location at 1,200 meters from ground zero, well within the zone of expected fatality or severe injury. The doctors documented the condition of the rectory, the level of destruction in the surrounding area, and the fate of neighbors who had been the same distance from the blast. Then they examined the priests themselves and found nothing. No burns, no radiation sickness, no cellular damage visible under the medical technology of the time. The doctors were puzzled, but assumed the effects would manifest later, as radiation damage often did. They marked the cases for follow-up and moved on to the thousands of critical patients who needed immediate care. But the effects never came. Months passed, then years, and the 8 Jesuit priests remained healthy, while people who had been farther from the blast developed cancers, leukemia, cataracts, and the countless other delayed effects of radiation exposure. In 1946, comprehensive medical studies of Hiroshima survivors began in earnest, and the priests were included in every major research project. The Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, a joint American-Japanese research organization, examined them repeatedly. They underwent blood tests, cellular analysis, eye examinations, and every other diagnostic procedure available. The technology improved over the decades, becoming more sophisticated and more capable of detecting even minor radiation damage. The results never changed. Test after test showed that these 8 men had no physiological evidence of having been exposed to the Hiroshima bombing at all. Father Schiffer became the most interviewed survivor in history, giving his account more than 1,600 times over the next 5 decades. Scientists, doctors, journalists, and religious investigators all wanted to know his secret. He was examined by over 200 different physicians in multiple countries. He traveled to medical conferences, submitted to experimental tests, and cooperated fully with every investigation. His message never wavered, but it also never satisfied the scientific community. He insisted there was no physical explanation for the survival of the 8 priests, no lucky positioning, no protective barrier, no structural anomaly that shielded them. Instead, he attributed their survival to a single practice, the daily recitation of the Rosary. He claimed that the Jesuit community had made a specific commitment to pray the Rosary together every day, and he believed this spiritual discipline had created what he called a protective shield of grace. The scientific establishment rejected this explanation entirely as expected. Radiation does not care about prayers. Blast waves do not recognize religious devotion. The laws of physics apply equally to believers and non-believers. Researchers proposed alternative theories. Perhaps the priests were protected by the specific construction of their building, though identical structures nearby were destroyed. Perhaps they were shielded by the terrain, though topographical analysis showed no such advantage. Perhaps their German genetics gave them resistance, though this made no scientific sense and was quickly abandoned. Perhaps the medical examinations were flawed, though decades of testing by independent teams made this unlikely. Every rational explanation was explored and found wanting. The priests should not have survived, and science could not explain why they did. The story might have remained an obscure medical curiosity, buried in research archives and known only to specialists in radiation medicine, except for one factor. The priests themselves refused to let it be forgotten. Father Schiffer, in particular, became an evangelist for what he believed was a miracle of divine protection. He traveled extensively, speaking at churches, universities, and conferences around the world. He appeared on television programs, gave radio interviews, and wrote detailed accounts of the bombing and its aftermath. His message was consistent and unwavering. The survival of the 8 Jesuit priests was not a scientific anomaly, but a direct intervention of God in response to their daily rosary devotion. He provided specific details about their spiritual practice, explaining that the community had made a solemn commitment to pray the 15 decades of the rosary together every evening without fail, offering these prayers for protection and in reparation for sin. The Catholic Church took notice but approached the claims with characteristic caution. Miracles, even seemingly obvious ones, require extensive investigation and documentation before receiving official recognition. The Vatican launched informal inquiries, collecting testimonies from the surviving priests and examining the medical evidence. What they found was compelling but not conclusive by ecclesiastical standards. The survival was extraordinary, certainly, but proving divine intervention requires more than the absence of a natural explanation. The Church needed to demonstrate that prayer was the causative factor, not just a correlation. They needed to rule out every possible physical explanation. They needed multiple witnesses, consistent testimony, and evidence that could withstand skeptical scrutiny. The investigation continued for decades, never reaching a definitive conclusion. The Church acknowledged the event as remarkable and worthy of reflection, but stopped short of declaring it an official miracle. This ambiguity created a fascinating dynamic. Believers embraced the story as proof of the power of prayer, particularly the Rosary, which holds special significance in Catholic devotional practice. The tale of the Hiroshima priests became a staple of religious education, repeated in sermons, written about in Catholic publications, and used as encouragement for maintaining regular prayer disciplines. For many faithful Catholics, no scientific explanation was necessary or desired. The priests prayed, the priests survived, and the connection was self-evident. The story provided comfort, reinforced belief, and offered hope that divine protection was real and accessible through simple, consistent devotion. It became one of the most powerful evangelization tools in modern Catholic history, inspiring countless people to take up the practice of daily rosary prayer. Meanwhile, the scientific community continued searching for answers. Researchers revisited the case repeatedly over the decades, each time hoping that new technology or new understanding of radiation effects would unlock the mystery. Studies in the 1960s examined cellular regeneration patterns. Research in the 1970s looked at genetic factors in radiation resistance. Investigations in the 1980s and 90s used advanced imaging and molecular analysis. Each generation of scientists approached the case with fresh eyes and better tools, and each generation came away without a satisfying natural explanation. The data remained stubbornly anomalous. The priests had been exactly where the records said they were. They had been exposed to levels of radiation that should have been lethal, and they had suffered no ill effects whatsoever. The debate intensified rather than resolved as time passed. Skeptics argued that the absence of proof was not proof of miracle, that unknown factors might explain the survival without invoking supernatural intervention. Believers countered that science's inability to explain the event after 70 years of trying was itself significant. Both sides could point to legitimate evidence supporting their position. Both sides could critique the weaknesses in the opposing argument. What neither side could do was definitively prove their case, leaving the survival of the 8 Jesuit priests suspended between miracle and mystery, between faith and science, between what we want to believe and what we can demonstrate. What often gets lost in the debate between faith and science is the human reality of what these priests experienced in the aftermath of their survival. Being spared while everyone around you dies creates a psychological burden that few people can comprehend. Father Kleinsorger, in particular, struggled with what modern psychology would recognize as survivor's guilt. He had walked through the ruins of Hiroshima, stepping over corpses, listening to the dying call for help he could not provide, watching children burn to death in fires he could not extinguish. He had held the hands of people as radiation sickness slowly destroyed them from the inside, their bodies betraying them in the most horrific ways imaginable. And through it all, he remained healthy, untouched, inexplicably protected, while people who had been farther from the blast suffered and died around him. The other priests carried similar burdens, though each processed the trauma differently. Father Schiffer channeled his experience into his evangelical mission, turning the survival into a teaching moment about faith and divine providence. For him, speaking about the miracle was a way to give meaning to the horror, to extract something redemptive from the ashes of Hiroshima. But others were more reserved, more conflicted about the attention their survival attracted. They had not asked to be spared. They had not sought to become symbols or subjects of scientific curiosity. They were simply priests who had stayed at their posts and somehow lived, and now they had to find a way to reconcile their survival with their faith, their guilt, and their continued ministry to a traumatized community. The years immediately following the bombing were particularly difficult. Hiroshima was a city of ghosts, populated by survivors who bore the physical and psychological scars of the attack. Keloid scars disfigured tens of thousands of victims, marking them permanently as hibakusha, atomic bomb survivors who faced discrimination and social stigma. Orphan children roamed the streets. Women who had been pregnant during the bombing gave birth to children with severe deformities and developmental problems. The radiation continued killing people years after the initial blast, with cancer rates among survivors remaining elevated for decades. The priests worked among these people, providing spiritual comfort and practical assistance, all while knowing that they alone had been mysteriously exempt from the suffering that defined the hibakusha experience. This created a complex relationship between the priests and the surviving community. Some hibakusha viewed the Jesuits with suspicion or resentment, questioning why foreign missionaries should be spared, while Japanese families were destroyed. Others saw their survival as a sign of hope, proof that some force, whether divine or simply fortunate, could protect against even the most terrible weapons. The priests themselves tried to downplay their exceptional status, focusing on their ministry rather than their survival story. But the questions never stopped coming. Every medical examination, every interview, every curious visitor reminded them that they were anomalies, living evidence of something that should not have been possible. By the 1950s, as the world moved into the Cold War era and nuclear weapons proliferated, the story of the Hiroshima priests took on new significance. The United States and Soviet Union were building arsenals capable of destroying civilization multiple times over. Cities around the world conducted nuclear attack drills. Families built fallout shelters in their backyards. The threat of atomic annihilation hung over humanity like a sword suspended by a thread. In this context, the survival of 8 men at Ground Zero in Hiroshima became more than just a religious curiosity or scientific puzzle. It became a symbol of hope that perhaps somehow protection from nuclear horror was possible. Whether that protection came from prayer, luck, or unknown physical factors mattered less than the simple fact that survival at Ground Zero had happened once and might therefore happen again. The turning point in how the world understood the Hiroshima priests came in 1976 during the International Eucharistic Congress in Philadelphia. Father Schiffer, then 71 years old and still showing no signs of radiation-related illness, was invited to speak before an audience of thousands. This was not a small academic conference or a local church gathering. This was one of the most significant Catholic events of the decade, with attendees from around the world and extensive media coverage. Father Schiffer took the stage and delivered what would become the most famous account of the Hiroshima miracle, a testimony that was recorded, transcribed, and distributed globally. His words were clear, detailed, and unambiguous. He described the bombing, the survival, the decades of medical examinations, and his unwavering conviction that the Rosary had saved them. What made this testimony particularly powerful was Father Schiffer's credibility. He was not a fanatic or a fringe figure. He was a respected Jesuit priest with impeccable academic credentials, fluent in multiple languages, and known for his careful, measured approach to theological questions. When he stated that more than 200 physicians had examined him and found no radiation effects, he was not exaggerating. He could name the doctors, cite the studies, and provide documentation. When he said that he and his fellow priests had been at 1,200 meters from Ground Zero, he could show maps, photographs, and official records confirming the location. His testimony was not based on faith alone, but on verifiable facts that led him to a conclusion that transcended scientific explanation. The audience listened in stunned silence as he described the impossible survival and attributed it entirely to daily rosary prayer. The response was immediate and polarizing. Religious media celebrated the testimony as one of the most important miracle accounts of the 20th century. Catholic publications ran feature stories. Rosary prayer groups cited Father Schiffer's words as motivation. Devotional literature incorporated the Hiroshima priests into the broader narrative of Marian intercession and the power of persistent prayer. The story spread rapidly through Catholic communities worldwide, becoming part of the oral tradition passed from parents to children, from priests to parishioners. It became a standard response to skeptics who questioned whether prayer had any real effect on physical reality. Here was documented proof, believers argued, that prayer could protect against the most destructive force humanity had ever created. But the scientific and skeptical communities pushed back hard. Critics pointed out that correlation does not equal causation, that the priest's prayer practice might be completely unrelated to their survival. They noted that thousands of Hiroshima residents probably prayed daily to various deities and still died horribly. They questioned whether all 8 priests had actually maintained perfect daily rosary practice or whether this detail had been embellished over time to strengthen the miracle narrative. They suggested that the survival might be explained by factors the priests were unaware of, such as specific structural elements of their building, momentary shielding by debris, or simple statistical luck. After all, some people survived even closer to ground zero in Hiroshima, including a man named Eizo Nomura, who was in a basement just 170 meters from the hypocenter and lived to tell the tale. His survival was never attributed to divine intervention. The debate revealed a fundamental gap in how different communities interpret extraordinary events. For those predisposed to believe in divine intervention, the Hiroshima priests represented exactly the kind of evidence they had been waiting for, a well-documented, multiply-witnessed event that defied natural explanation and corresponded with specific religious practice. For those committed to naturalistic explanations, the case represented an unsolved puzzle, certainly, but not one that required abandoning the principles of physics and medicine. The priests had survived, the mechanism was unclear, but invoking supernatural causes was premature and unnecessary. Both positions were internally consistent. Both could marshal evidence. Neither could definitively disprove the other. And so the story of the Hiroshima priests remained suspended between miracle and mystery, a Rorschach test that revealed more about the interpreter than about the event itself. What gives the Hiroshima priest story its enduring power is not just the survival itself, but the specific pattern of evidence that has emerged over decades of investigation. This was not a case of vague claims or distant memories growing more miraculous with time. The facts were documented immediately after the bombing and remained consistent through 70 years of scrutiny. The priests were examined by Allied occupation forces within weeks of the attack. Their location was verified by military surveyors mapping the destruction. The condition of their rectory was photographed and analyzed by engineers studying blast effects. Every aspect of the case was recorded in real time by parties who had no interest in promoting a miracle narrative. These were military and scientific investigators trying to understand a new weapon, and the anomalous survival of 8 men at 1,200 meters was simply a data point that did not fit their models. As medical science advanced through the latter half of the 20th century, the priests were re-examined using progressively more sophisticated technology. In the 1960s, researchers used electron microscopy to examine cellular structures at unprecedented resolution. In the 1970s and 80s, genetic analysis became possible, allowing scientists to look for chromosomal damage and mutations that radiation typically causes. In the 1990s and 2000s, advanced imaging techniques could detect even minor tissue abnormalities. Each technological leap offered the possibility of finally finding the hidden damage, the subtle radiation signature that earlier methods had missed. Each examination came back negative. Father Schiffer lived to 90, dying in 1994 of causes unrelated to Hiroshima. Father Kleinsorge survived until 1977. The other priests followed similar patterns, living into old age without the cancers, organ failures or systemic breakdowns that characterized long-term hibakusha mortality. The statistical improbability of this outcome cannot be overstated. By the 1980s, comprehensive epidemiological studies of Hiroshima survivors had established clear dose-response relationships between distance from hypocenter and health outcomes. Researchers could predict with reasonable accuracy what percentage of people at any given distance would develop specific cancers or other radiation-related conditions. The priests at 1,200 meters should have been in a zone with approximately 60 to 70% mortality within 5 years and elevated cancer risk for survivors. Instead, all 8 lived, and all 8 remained healthy. The odds of this happening by chance alone have been calculated at astronomical levels, though exact figures depend on assumptions about exposure and shielding that remain uncertain. This is where the story becomes genuinely mysterious, in a way that transcends religious belief. Even committed skeptics acknowledge that something unusual happened in that rectory. The question is not whether the priest's survival was extraordinary, But what mechanism explains it? The prayer hypothesis, while unfalsifiable and therefore unscientific, at least provides a coherent narrative that accounts for all the facts. The priests prayed daily, they survived, and no other factor has been identified that adequately explains the outcome. Alternative explanations require assuming unknown variables, fortunate coincidences stacked upon coincidences, or measurement errors that somehow persisted across decades and hundreds of independent examinations. Neither the religious nor the scientific explanation is fully satisfying, which is precisely what makes this case so compelling. Father Schiffer himself seemed to understand this tension. In his later interviews, he acknowledged that he could not prove divine intervention in a way that would satisfy scientific standards. He could only present the facts as he experienced them and offer his interpretation based on his faith and his lived experience. He never claimed to have seen angels or heard divine voices. He never suggested that the survival made him special or more holy than the victims who died. He simply maintained that the Jesuit community had made a commitment to daily rosary prayer, that they had kept this commitment faithfully, and that when the atomic fire consumed Hiroshima, they alone in their neighborhood survived unharmed. The connection seemed obvious to him, even if it remained unprovable, and for millions of believers around the world, his testimony was enough. The legacy of the Hiroshima priests extends far beyond the Catholic community, or even religious circles generally. Their story has become part of the broader cultural conversation about nuclear weapons, survival, and the limits of scientific explanation. In Japan, where the hibakusha experience is central to national identity and memory, the priests occupy an unusual position. They are simultaneously outsiders, foreign missionaries who happen to be present during Japan's greatest tragedy, and witnesses whose testimony carries unique weight precisely because of their survival. Japanese scholars have studied the case extensively, and while official scientific consensus remains that the survival was likely due to unknown physical factors, popular culture has embraced the mystery. The story appears in Japanese books, television documentaries, and educational materials, often presented without definitive explanation, allowing audiences to draw their own conclusions. In the United States, the story took on different dimensions shaped by America's complex relationship with the atomic bombings. For some Americans, particularly those who justify the use of atomic weapons as necessary to end the war, the survival of the priests is simply an interesting footnote, a lucky break in an otherwise devastating but militarily justified action. For others, especially those troubled by the moral implications of atomic warfare, the Hiroshima priests represent something more profound, a reminder that amid the calculated destruction of total war, something sacred and unexplainable persisted. The fact that the survivors were men of God, specifically Catholic priests in a largely non-Christian country, carries symbolic weight that resonates across theological and philosophical boundaries. Their survival asks uncomfortable questions about providence, suffering, and whether divine protection operates in human conflicts. The scientific investigation of the case essentially concluded by the early 2000s, not because researchers found a definitive answer, but because there was nothing left to examine. The priests had been studied exhaustively. Their medical records were complete. The physical evidence from Hiroshima had been analyzed countless times. Modern radiation physics and biology could not identify any plausible mechanism that would have protected 8 men at 1,200 meters, while everyone else at similar distances died or suffered severe effects. The rectory's construction offered no special shielding. The terrain provided no unusual protection. Genetic analysis showed nothing exceptional about the priests' DNA. After 6 decades of investigation, using progressively more sophisticated tools, science had to accept what it hates most, an unsolved mystery with insufficient data to eliminate any hypothesis conclusively. This scientific inconclusiveness has allowed the religious interpretation to flourish unchallenged in communities of faith. Catholic parishes around the world teach the Hiroshima priest's story in religious education classes. Rosary prayer groups cite it as encouragement. Marian devotion websites feature Father Schiffer's testimony prominently. The narrative has been simplified and streamlined through countless retellings. 8 priests prayed the Rosary daily. They survived the atomic bomb at Ground Zero without injury, and 200 doctors could find no radiation effects. The theological implication is clear. Consistent, faithful prayer provides divine protection even against the most terrible weapons humanity can devise. For believers seeking tangible evidence that their spiritual practices matter in the physical world, the Hiroshima priests offer exactly that evidence. Yet even among believers, thoughtful voices have raised important questions about what the story really means. If prayer protected these 8 men, what about the thousands of faithful Catholics, Buddhists, Shintoists, and practitioners of other religions who surely prayed just as fervently and died anyway? What about the children who could not have earned divine protection through spiritual discipline? Does the miracle narrative inadvertently suggest that the victims somehow failed in their faith or prayer life? These are uncomfortable theological problems that the simple miracle narrative glosses over. Some Catholic theologians have proposed more nuanced interpretations, suggesting that the priest's survival might have been intended not as a reward, but as a mission, preserving witnesses who could testify to both the horror of atomic weapons and the possibility of divine mercy, even in the midst of apocalyptic destruction. The priests themselves, particularly in their later years, seem to gravitate toward this more complex understanding. Father Kleinsorge, who took the Japanese name Father Makoto Takakura and became a Japanese citizen after the war, spent his remaining decades working with hibakusha, particularly focusing on the psychological and spiritual trauma that persisted long after physical wounds healed. He rarely spoke about his own survival, preferring to direct attention to those who suffered. Father Schiffer continued his evangelization work, but also emphasized that the Rosary was not a magical talisman, but a discipline of faith that opened hearts to divine grace in whatever form that grace might take. Their survival, they suggested, was less about being spared, and more about being called to witness, to serve, and to testify to the possibility of hope, even in humanity's darkest moments. Today, 80 years after the bombing of Hiroshima, the story of the 8 Jesuit priests remains as compelling and controversial as ever. The rectory where they lived no longer stands, replaced by modern buildings in a city that has been entirely rebuilt. The church they served was eventually demolished and reconstructed. The physical evidence has largely disappeared, absorbed into the relentless forward march of urban development and time. What remains is testimony, medical records, photographs, and the enduring mystery of how 8 men survived where thousands died. In an age of advanced medical imaging, genetic sequencing, and sophisticated radiation physics, science still cannot provide a definitive natural explanation for their survival. The case file remains open, not because new evidence might emerge, but because closing it would require admitting either that miracles are possible or that our understanding of radiation effects is fundamentally incomplete. The broader implications of the Hiroshima priest story extend into questions about how we understand reality itself. Modern Western culture operates on an implicit assumption that physical laws are universal, invariable, and ultimately discoverable through scientific method. Miracles, by definition, violate this assumption. They suggest that reality is more complex, more permeable to non-physical causation than materialist philosophy allows. The Hiroshima priest's case is particularly challenging because it cannot be easily dismissed as ancient legend, pre-scientific superstition, or poorly documented folklore. This happened in the modern era, under the observation of trained scientists and physicians, with documentation that meets rigorous historical standards. The survival is not disputed, the absence of radiation effects is not questioned. Only the interpretation divides us, and that division reveals a fundamental disagreement about what kinds of explanations are acceptable for extraordinary events. For the Catholic Church, the story has become one of the most powerful evangelization tools of the modern era, even without official miracle status. It appears in countless books, websites, and media productions promoting Rosary devotion. Youth ministers use it to encourage young people to maintain prayer disciplines. Missionary organizations cite it as evidence that faith has practical protective power. The narrative has been incorporated into the broader tradition of Marian apparitions and intercessions, connecting the Hiroshima priests to Fatima, Lourdes, and other sites where the Virgin Mary allegedly intervened in human affairs. Whether or not the Vatican ever officially recognizes the survival as miraculous, popular Catholic culture has already made that determination. The story is told as truth, as evidence, as proof that prayer matters in tangible, measurable ways. Yet the story also serves as a sobering reminder of what humanity is capable of unleashing. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima killed somewhere between 129,000 and 226,000 people, most of them civilians, many of them children. It inaugurated the nuclear age, a period in which humanity has possessed the technological capability to destroy itself completely. The weapons we have now make little boy look primitive by comparison. Modern thermonuclear devices are measured in megatons rather than kilotons, capable of destroying entire metropolitan areas in a single blast. The existence of these weapons, the ongoing proliferation of nuclear technology, and the continuing threat of atomic warfare make the Hiroshima priest story perpetually relevant. Their survival is not just a religious curiosity, but a haunting question. If divine protection is possible, why was it so selective? And if it was not divine protection, what hope does anyone have if these weapons are used again? The priests themselves are all dead now. Father Schiffer, the last surviving member of the group and the most vocal witness, died in 1994 at age 90. With his death, the direct testimony ended, though his recorded interviews, written accounts, and the extensive medical documentation ensure that the story will persist. The questions he raised, the mystery he embodied, and the faith he proclaimed continue to challenge both believers and skeptics. His life after Hiroshima was not easy, marked by the psychological burden of survival, the endless questions from investigators and journalists, and the complex responsibility of being a living witness to both human destructive capability and alleged divine mercy. But he never wavered in his conviction that the Rosary had saved him, and he dedicated his remaining decades to sharing that conviction with anyone who would listen. The final truth about the Hiroshima priests may never be definitively established. Science cannot prove the negative, cannot demonstrate conclusively that no physical factor explains the survival. Faith cannot prove the positive, cannot provide empirical verification of divine intervention. We are left with a story that refuses easy categorization, a documented historical event that sits uncomfortably at the intersection of the natural and the supernatural. Perhaps that discomfort is the point. Perhaps the real legacy of the 8 Jesuit priests is not a simple lesson about prayer or physics, but a profound reminder that reality contains depths we have not yet fathomed, that the universe may be stranger and more mysterious than either religious dogma or scientific materialism fully captures. They survived the unsurvivable, lived long lives when they should have died horrible deaths, and left us with a question that echoes across 8 decades. What really happened in that rectory on the morning of August 6, 1945? The answer, whatever it is, matters far more than we might want to admit.